Every time we talk about it at mine, my mom will say, that really scares me. And she's not alone. So why is that? Technology isn't inherently good or bad. It's how we choose to use it. But with the development of AI moving so rapidly, it doesn't take an expert to see how it has the potential to fundamentally reshape how we live our lives. So the choice really is ours. Will AI's benefits inure broadly to all Americans or only to a few? Will it be used to narrow inequities that already exist or worsen them? Should it be developed and used ethically to strengthen our democracy or further drive us apart? And failing to come together to answer these questions, that is, doing nothing, will in fact be our answer, but not the one that we all want. It's important to remember that although AI is in its relative infancy, AI and related automated algorithms are already in use. Let me give you 4 brief examples of what that can look like in everyday life today. First, graduates of historically Black colleges or universities were given higher loan prices by an algorithm used for loan underwriting, even when taking into account other factors. Second, many women's applications were dismissed by a hiring algorithm when their resumes used the word women's, as in women's chess club captain. Third, an algorithm for deploying police officers sent them to the neighborhoods they already were visiting regularly, not the ones with higher crime. Fourth, drivers for one company were made ineligible for bonuses by AI tools monitoring their driving patterns, even when they were actually cut off by other cars or reacting to events outside of their control. And I think many of you may have heard of the robocalls in New Hampshire that used a deepfake of President Biden's voice to discourage citizens from voting in the New Hampshire primary elections. These are not the apocalyptic scenarios some might fear, but they get to the heart of our society's basic fairness, the kinds of things that families do care about at their kitchen tables, and we've barely scratched the surface of how it could impact us as it's more broadly deployed. That's why CAP and the folks assembled today pushed tirelessly for President Biden to issue an executive order on artificial intelligence. It was a great start, and we think there's even more that agencies can and must do now. But obviously, there's a central role for Congress to set the rules of the road for this new technology, and while we're at it, for technology and online services more generally. We were glad to see that Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer quickly pulled together a bipartisan group of senators to hold a series of closed-door insight forums on AI and look for areas of consensus. Now the House, too, has launched its own bipartisan task force. These discussions show there's bipartisan recognition of the stakes of inaction. And the context for today's discussion, 4 AI issues lawmakers cannot ignore, are really about those things that our groups feel must be addressed in any AI legislation. And these 4 areas are guardrails for ethical AI development and deployment, protections for workers, civil rights protections, and election integrity and misinformation mitigation. Each of these groups consider each of these issues to be of critical importance when addressing AI's challenges and opportunities. So we're excited to tackle head-on what we think lawmakers should do in these spaces. Finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't note some related developments this week. Aid to Ukraine was passed as part of a broader package that also included some safeguards on the sale of Americans' personal data to foreign adversaries, and also the required divestment of TikTok to operate here in the United States. It should be striking to everyone that after a decade of hearings on privacy, Section 230, content moderation, and antitrust, the only real tech regulation Congress has passed into law would force the sale or ban of a single app. If that's all we do, then we will have failed. Congress and the Biden administration must not let the TikTok bill be the only action they take this year. The American people are demanding that Washington act to protect themselves and their kids online, not just from foreign actors, but from companies that vacuum up their information and seek to manipulate them online. It's long past time for Congress to pass a robust federal privacy law and children's online safety law this year. That would lay an essential foundation for much more robust AI legislation. So now I'll gladly turn things over to Adam Connor, the Vice President of CAP's Technology Policy Team, who will introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Ben, for that introduction. And welcome everybody to the CAP virtual event for AI issues lawmakers can't ignore. I'm Adam Connor, and I am the Vice President for Technology Policy at the Center for American Progress. First, a few logistical notes. This event is being closed captioned, so please click on the Show Captions button to enable that. We will be taking audience questions at the end of the event. Please type your questions using the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. Now on to our programming. In March, the 5 groups on this panel today, CAP, the AFL-CIO, the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, Public Citizen, and Public Knowledge, sent a letter to congressional leaders highlighting 4 issues in the AI age that we felt had to be addressed. As been mentioned, those were guardrails for ethical AI development and deployment, protections for workers and measures to ensure that AI broadly benefits society, civil rights protections to combat discrimination and bias in automated systems, and election integrity and how to best mitigate misinformation and disinformation such as deepfakes. Each of these issues is of critical importance, and each of them deserves a more in-depth and fulsome conversation. So we wanted to convene today's event to allow us to discuss these important issues as they relate to AI in much more depth, so that lawmakers in Congress, in state legislatures, and around the world can think about how to best address them. I am joined today by an all-star panel. We have Amanda Ballantyne, who is the director of the AFL-CIO's Technology Institute. Frank Torres, the Privacy and AI Fellow at the New Center for Civil Rights and Technology at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Lisa Gilbert, the Executive Vice President of Public Citizen, and Nicholas Garcia, a Policy Counsel at Public Knowledge. So we'll start by asking a question for all of our panelists, and then we will go to a more fulsome discussion. So thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate you today. And Frank, I'll start with you, and the kind of similar question will be asked of everyone. But the kind of question I'm going to pose to everyone is, why is the issue you're going to highlight one that lawmakers can't ignore? And what do you view as a way that lawmakers could or should address this issue? So for civil rights protections to combat discrimination and bias in automated systems, why is that an issue lawmakers cannot ignore in the AI age?
Thank you, Adam, and thank you for NCAP for organizing this event. Hey, listen, AI is hard, right? And it's easy to get very complicated when you think about AI. But let's get back to some basics. First, we expect the products that we use to work and not be harmful, to be safe and effective, essentially. Like with cars or drugs, right? We expect our cars to be safe, and there are rules in place to help ensure that. There's inspections and other things that happen. The same with the pharmaceutical drugs that we take, for health issues. We expect them to be safe when we use them. When decisions get made about us, we expect them to be fair, whether it be applying for a job, applying for school, applying for a loan, or in the healthcare that we get. Why should we have different expectations for AI? Right? AI is being used today in ways that have caused real harm to real people, especially in high risk and high rights impacting ways. In housing, there have been issues with tenant screening. In healthcare, in how it determines the level of care for individuals. In education and in criminal justice. Take facial recognition as an example. Innocent people have been arrested in front of their children and suffered serious consequences, thrown in jail while they await, the resolution of the issue, because the facial recognition technology didn't work. We can do better, and Congress needs to act to help fix some of these problems. In many cases, you may not even know that the AI system is being used. So you may not have any real recourse or ability to really challenge the decision that's been made about you. And unfortunately, it's our vulnerable communities and communities of color that are most often impacted. So typically when this happens, whenever there's new industries or new things coming on, Congress, it does its thing for a little bit, but at some point, they need to act. And in this case, they need to act to establish the rules of road for everyone when it comes to the everyday uses of AI technology. What does that mean? Well, the White House provided a roadmap with their AI Bill of Rights and their White House EO and the subsequent materials that have come out. AI systems should not discriminate. They should be fair. They should be equitable. We need to consider its impact on people. It needs to be tested and assessed for bias and fairness. This is actually consistent with the promises that many companies have already made in their AI principles through the years, that AI will be fair. And Congress must help ensure our civil rights are protected, and in doing so, uphold our democratic values. At the same time, hold big tech accountable for the products and services they create. Now, some would have us believe that the only issues with AI are don't stifle innovation, don't do anything to upend US competition, and existential threats like killer robots. I'm not denying that any of those aren't issues that may need to be addressed and we need to be part of our consideration, but that doesn't mean that we ignore civil rights. The technology should work the way it says it's supposed to work and not cause harm. Simply put, AI is no longer nascent, it's no longer new, and like with cars or drugs, if the public is expected to trust it, they must be trustworthy. And so Congress must act to address the civil rights concerns.
Thank you, Frank. I appreciate that. Amanda, turning to you now. We want to talk about why worker protections and protections for workers and measures to ensure that AI broadly benefits society. Why is that an AI issue that lawmakers can't ignore?
Thanks, Adam. And first, I want to say thank you to your team at CAP, to Public Citizen, to the Leadership Conference, to Public Knowledge, for your partnership in this work, and also for hosting this important meeting. I think that Frank said it first. Technology can be really, data-driven technology can be great for workers. It can also have really serious potential harms. And much of the kind of newer versions of AI that are just hitting the market now are untested. And they will have significant impacts on workers, both in the workplace and on workers' potential to get and to keep jobs. We look at this in the labor movement as a serious industrial revolution, and we think that it needs guardrails and positive forward-looking programming supports that are sort of commensurate with the type of disruptions that it could create in our workforce. We need to make sure that this tech works for all of us and for all working people and not against us. We start just by saying there are things we need to protect workers from, that this technology does, that are observable things that happen. Workplace intensification, speed up of work, and de-skilling of work, where you have algorithmic and automated management systems starting to direct workers in the workplace in ways that not only can cause workplace injury and mental health issues, but also really de-skill work and take what's human out of work in ways that can be, take the dignity out of work, frankly. We also see, I think, a potential for significant disruption and displacement in certain sectors of the economy, particularly as the result of generative AI. And so we need to be talking in a forward-looking way about what are the workforce development systems that we need in place in order to help workers make a transition. Part of it might be just upskilling to remain competitive in the workplace, but part of it might mean a deeper conversation about connecting economic development strategies with workforce development strategies and making sure that those strategies are worker-centered and that they have labor engagement. Overall, from our perspective, when you see the potential for disruption in the workforce like we see with the potential of AI and generative AI, there really needs to be an expansion of worker rights to organize and worker rights to hold accountable their employers for the impacts that these technologies have. And so we also are talking about how we can really ensure that worker voice is engaged in every phase of the innovation process, and that workers can really get to the table and bargain with their employers over how these technologies impact them in the workplace and also beyond the workplace. So thanks very much, Adam. Appreciate it.
Thank you, man. And I'm really struck by, I think, that phrase you said, we want the tech to work for all of us, for all working people, and not to work against us, I think is really pretty profound and succinct. Nick, turning to you now, why are guardrails for ethical AI development and deployment of AI an issue that AI that lawmakers cannot ignore?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. And I'm going to echo what everyone else is saying, which has been great to work with this group on these really critical issues. And thank you to CAP for organizing this event here today. So when it comes to AI development and deployment in an ethical way. This is something that lawmakers cannot ignore right now for two big reasons. First is that, as we've seen over the last year, AI development and deployment moves really fast, and it can move quickly in unexpected ways. It's going to continue to move that quickly. It's going to become increasingly integrated into our lives, into services that many of us already use, and it's going to impact us in unexpected ways. We've seen with the development of many of the biggest platforms today that that's something that we cannot afford to just let happen without clear guardrails and accountability for when harms are going to happen. And we know they will happen because that's the second big reason we need to act on this. As Frank was talking about, long before this current surge in interest surrounding generative AI systems and their breakthroughs, we knew that automated decision-making systems and algorithms and machine learning models posed real risks of reinforcing bias, of concealing discrimination, and of being harmful to the people that they interact with, like with social media algorithms. We are long overdue, basically, to address these problems already. And so now that there is going to be a continued development and upsurge in terms of the deployment and development of AI models, and that's going to continue to move in unexpected and new directions, we have to meet those challenges head on and do something to set some real guardrails and accountability mechanisms. What that means for lawmakers is that there's a lot of things that we can do that we already know are important solutions for solving those problems, like comprehensive privacy legislation, data minimization, and those kind of things. When it comes to AI, public knowledge, we believe in a combination of really focused sector-specific enforcement and also making sure that we're going to have broad, flexible, expert regulatory oversight with the real knowledge to act quickly and flexibly as this technology continues to change. We know that we're going to need disclosure and transparency requirements. That way consumers can interact with models with confidence and know when they are dealing with AI systems. And so people can hold those AI systems to account and learn more about how they work, so we can evaluate how they are affecting our lives. And we need serious resources building on that, devoted to developing robust guidelines for real independent audits and evaluations of AI models, not just relying on first-party or second-party auditors who are paid by the AI companies, but moving beyond that into government evaluations and audits or genuine third-party evaluations from civil rights groups, civil society, and other third-party organizations that can really hold people to account for how these things are impacting us. And the last bit of this is that none of that stands in opposition to innovation and competition. In so many sectors, we can see that guardrails, accountability, rules of the road, far from hindering innovation and competition, they can really enable it. So that's why we really need lawmakers to act swiftly to give us those guardrails in order to make sure we're not only protecting people and consumers, but we're also protecting this new ecosystem and environment for safe and ethical development.
Thank you, Nick. I really appreciate your comments there. And finally, last but not least, Lisa, can you talk to us about why election integrity, misinformation mitigation is an issue that lawmakers, when it comes to AI, really can't ignore?
Thanks so much, Adam. And thanks, I'll echo everyone else to the CAP team and all the great partners on this call. I so appreciate the chance to dig in on the overlay between AI and democracy and the need for action here. Generative AI presents an array of serious threats to our elections, including the intensification of disinformation, customized targeting of voters, AI-generated political deepfakes, and potentially the undermining of social trust as it becomes harder to discern truth from reality. To dig in a bit on political deepfakes specifically, the threat, of course, is that they can make a candidate appear to have said or done things that they didn't say or do. Without regulation, we face the reality of candidates, committees, and outside groups using AI technology to create video or audio clips that, for example, purport to show an opponent making an offensive statement, speaking gibberish, accepting a bribe, and of course, a blockbuster deepfake video released shortly before an election could go viral and be widely disseminated with no ability for voters to determine that it's fake, no time for a candidate to deny it, and possibly no way for a candidate to show convincingly that it is fake. It's also possible that deepfakes will be used to tell people to go to the wrong polling places, to do inaccurate things, to register to vote, and more. And they have the ability to convincingly mimic trusted validators, friends, and family that make them even more persuasive than traditional mis and disinformation. Depending where they're viewed, it's also possible for generative AI to adapt and anthropomorphize in believable ways. And of course, the channels that already disseminate misinformation will do so with AI-generated content, but with this far more believable substance. In addition to this acute problem in any given electoral contest, really the worst case outcome of pervasive use of deepfakes over time is that the public may become conditioned to doubt the authenticity of real video or audio. For example, it's a near certainty that candidate Trump would have denied the reality of the Access Hollywood recording if deepfake technology had been widespread at the time. AI-generated deepfakes pose a genuine challenge to the future functioning of our democracy. If voters can't trust the authenticity of what they see and hear, it's hard to overstate the impact of that. So to address all these threats, we need rules requiring disclosure of AI-generated deepfakes. And without such requirements in place, those advertisements need to be banned. To that end, as some may know, Public Citizen petitioned the FEC for a rule prohibiting deceptive political deepfakes earlier this year. We asked the FEC to specify in guidance, as well as an amendment to their fraudulent misrepresentation regulation, that you cannot fraudulently misrepresent other candidates or political parties using AI. The FEC may or may not act. We hope they do. But regardless, their prohibition only applies to candidates and parties. So it doesn't cover outside groups. And we also need legislation. Public Citizen, we've developed a model state bill, which we've been working to move to great success. 12 states now have some form of a bill that bans deepfakes in elections or requires disclosure. This has been really exciting to see, and we hope that this momentum is able to influence creation of federal law so that we can accomplish the same goals across the nation. To that end, numerous strong bipartisan legislative pieces have been introduced at the federal level. Just one example, Senators Collins, Coons, Hawley, and Klobuchar have put forth their Protect Elections from Deceptive AI Act. It would ban the use of AI to generate materially deceptive content, falsely depicting federal candidates in political ads. And that's just one example. There are numerous other bills that have been put forth, which I won't go into since time is limited. I'll just close by saying that, as we are all closely watching the Senate process and the House process for what might happen next, any of these bills, any eventual packages have to include provisions around democracy and protecting our elections. The risks of not doing so are just too great.
Thank you, Lisa. And I think that echoes for not just our democracy issues, but our concerns on civil rights in the workplace and around ethical building and deployment of AI. So I want to dig in a little bit on some of these issues. So I want to start with Frank. You mentioned how essential it is for lawmakers to consider protections to combat discrimination and bias in automated systems. And so the Biden administration recently finalized guidance from the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, for how federal agencies use AI. And in that, they detailed kind of certain instances where AI use to be considered safety impacting or rights impacting and kind of triggering additional levels of compliance. Is that something you think helps bridge some gaps and holes? And is that something that Congress should look to consider for a similar broader classification about how AI can impact safety or civil rights?
Absolutely. I think it lays a strong foundation that Congress can use or build upon as far as putting down some clear requirements. Again, and none of these are surprising. The AI systems shouldn't discriminate, and you shouldn't use it if they are biased or discriminatory. That's kind of, hopefully that's not controversial, and most people would agree with that, I hope. But then what does that mean? What do you tell the engineers and the folks that actually have to put this into operation? Well, you should test it, assess it, test it, look at impacted communities, just be thoughtful about the data that you put into it, make sure that the training data that you use is not biased, because if it is, that the outcomes in the real world could exacerbate those biases and reflect the biases in the training data. Be transparent, let people know what's going on, have some sort of recourse mechanism. And hey, just because AI can be a bright, shiny object doesn't mean you have to use it. I think one interesting part of the OMB guidance is it recognizes that it might be a good idea to look at alternatives and see whether or not an AI system and the investment in the AI system is the best choice for doing what work needs to be done. And so all this, I think, again, provides some good direction to what Congress can do, because remember, the OMB guidance applies to what the federal government and federal agencies do. It doesn't apply to commercial entities, and that's why another reason why we need Congress to act.
Thanks, Frank. Great points. I think following up on that same topic, Nick, how does some of what Frank has outlined as being critical on these civil rights protections, kind of sync with some of the proposed or ideal guardrails around ethical AI development and deployment you think lawmakers should consider?
Yeah, I think first, when it comes to thinking about federal and government use cases, Frank has it spot on that we should be cautious and deliberate in terms of how we are increasingly leaping to integrate things, especially if the federal government is going to be adopting things that is not built in-house and that are developed by contractors or other outside private companies. There needs to be really robust guidelines. And the NTIA, which we'll report, which we can talk about a little bit later, gets to some of those contracting requirements, and OMB has some of those requirements for contractors. That's really essential. At the same time, when we are thinking about federal actors developing use cases for AI internally, because we are recognizing that this is a really powerful technology, I don't think we should necessarily shy away from some of those instances. But this is an opportunity for the federal government to really lead by example in these areas. They need to really step up and figure out how to solve these big challenges around evaluation and assessment and impact, and develop really the best practices for how these AI systems should work. And that's a real opportunity that we have with federal funding and research dollars to develop systems the right way that build our values into them, and then to make sure that those standards are the same standards that we hold other people to in the private sector when they are developing AI models and rolling them out or deploying them. The other thing that I want to build off of what Frank is saying is that what we already know is that AI is not an exception to the law. And many federal regulators and enforcers are already taking great steps to take action and make sure that they are applying their existing regulations and laws around things like bias and discrimination, protecting civil rights. And that's something that needs to continue to happen. Where legislators and lawmakers can step in there is that there are going to be areas where targeted smart action, like bills, can close loopholes, can provide clarifications if the regulatory process isn't moving along, and also importantly, ensure that regulators and enforcers have the resources that they need to continue to act in these areas, because this is a new technology. People need to understand it. It can make things invisible or more difficult to identify, and they may need additional resources in order to make sure that they can continue to do the enforcement job that people on the civil rights, housing, employment kind of beats already know how to do. They just need those tools to do it and the clarifications to make sure that they can take decisive action in these areas to keep protecting people.
Thanks, Nick. And I think I saw a letter signed by many groups earlier this week really calling for the full funding and increased funding of NIST, for example, which is, I think, essential, particularly as several of the groups here are working with NIST and the new AI Safety Institute at Department of Commerce and NIST on these very issues. And I think I speak for all of us that we are looking to Congress to not just address how AI is used in a commercial context, but to think about its government use as well, because those are both kind of critical places. I want to turn back to the workplace, Amanda. We've talked a lot about worker protections, but you mentioned mentioned this in your remarks, and I'd love to dig in a little more. The importance not just to protections and workers' rights, but there's really an important piece about worker power to consider. And why is it that it's so critical to advance workers' rights to form and join unions or to collectively bargain over AI in the workplace beyond just maybe protections we could put against abuse? How does that play such an essential role? Oops, I think you muted.
It's a great question. So what we would say is, first of all, there are so many different use cases for data-driven tech and AI that it's collective bargaining actually provides a really incredible tool for regulation in a workplace specific context. So I think for starters, a lot of these technologies, I think another speaker mentioned, are often invisible. They're in the black box. Workers, consumers might not even know that these types of systems are operating, what information they're collecting, what information they're storing, who has access to that information. Those things are deeply important to workers being able to, enforce their rights in a situation. And so, as this technology develops and deploys and continues to kind of create new types of technology that can be implemented in the workplace, collective bargaining offers a very pragmatic tool for workers to be engaged with their employers on what technologies are implemented in the shop, how those technologies are used, and how they shouldn't be used. We find in labor management partnership situations that those types of conversations among employers, either at the bargaining table or as a part of other sort of union engagement efforts in a shop, can lead to really good efficiencies and a lot of understanding of how technologies can and shouldn't be used. We find, and I think that if you look at the collective bargaining victories that have happened over the last year, a lot of how we're starting to think about regulating this technology in the law has come from the wins that we're seeing at the bargaining table around how to use this technology responsibly. So we're not just saying, hey, don't implement it. We're saying, let's have a conversation about how. So we would say, in this case, worker power is important because this technology can be incredibly disruptive. And I think that, without a deep engagement between labor and management that can be fostered by collective bargaining or other types of sort of public activity that's engaging employers around workplace issues, we end up in a situation where we could have a lot of disruption in a lot of job loss potentially, right? And I think in the labor movement, we sort of point to this period of deindustrialization that we went through, for most of my life, as jobs were being offshored and worker rights were really being constrained through a lot of legal decisions. We could end up in a situation like that economically in this country if we don't start to create systems to build worker power, but then also to build public policy solutions for a just transition as this technology continues to shift and shape different sectors. A lot of this work is really sector specific. The technology will impact different sectors in different ways. There are places where I think there's an extreme public interest, like the implementation of AI in a healthcare situation or in the administration of public benefits, or other things like that, where there's a real world impact of whether these technologies are functional or not. Understand that workers really understand whether these technologies are functional or not. And so we're encouraging, not only an expansion of bargaining rights and other types of engagement with workers, but really thinking through how to make sure that workers are at the table to talk about how this technology can and can't and shouldn't be used for the public benefit as well.
Thanks, Amanda. And it strikes me that too often we fall into a commercial language context of developers, deployers, or end users, and it really ignores the fact that this may be imposed by your workplace and impact people, who are workers in a different kind of non-commercial context. So I think that's really, really critical. Lisa, I want to go, on this topic to you, because there's obviously a key link here between corporate power and worker power and that imbalance that we've seen. And, how are other corporate power issues and worker issues related to AI that lawmakers should also consider?
Such a good question. There are so many areas where Congress should put focus to deal with corporate power issues surrounding AI. If AI technology turns out to be even a tenth as important as the tech companies are saying, it's going to reshape society in really fundamental ways. And the decisions about how that happens should be shaped by the public and workers and government regulation, not by private corporate monopoly. So just a few areas to pick up, although there are a lot of different places where this is relevant. first, corporate concentration. It's of course a problem if the influx of AI technology into society only buttresses the power of already enormous tech companies like Google and Amazon. Another corporate imbalance issue to flag is legal liability. Getting this right is going to be crucial. It will be, the near-term means we have to hold AI companies accountable and to incentivize them to act with appropriate caution. So Congress needs to think about the need for liability rules that carry forth the idea that AI companies are responsible for any foreseeable misuse of their tech to perpetrate fraud or illegal activity. And then a third thing to raise in the sort of corporate imbalance space is just the consistent need for consumer protection to stay front and center. Corporate power and profit often cuts against that. So a ton of issues flow from that very broad concern, but just picking a few, as Amanda mentioned, consumer health products that big companies are already beginning to push. We obviously need consistent human oversight to limit harms, protect patients and workers, to provide equitable access to care. Financial consumer harms, there is a real reason to worry about AI influenced investor scams, investment advisor conflicts of interest, and deceptive marketing of loans and financial products. And then third, just deceptive and unfair advertising, marketing strategies that corporations utilize, which may use human seeming AI. I could really go on and on. I think, corporate power imbalance, corporations versus workers and consumers is just an area where Congress should be actively thinking as they're pondering how to legislate and regulate around AI.
Thanks, Lisa. I want to turn to AI guardrails as we chug along through our kind of 4 key issues. Nick, you've talked about the importance of guardrails, for the ethical AI development and deployment. And you mentioned briefly earlier, the National Telecommunications Information Administration, or NTIA, recently released the AI Accountability Policy Report, which followed their extensive 2023 requests for comment process. Are there elements of that report, which I should say is well laid out, but fairly long, or other efforts you think lawmakers should be looking at in that report, or other places as they look at the kind of appropriate measures to tailor here?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a strong report, strong output from that, like very huge public comment and public engagement set of comments that they got. And it does a good job, as long as the report is distilling the even longer record that they got. So I think the output of that is quite strong. All 8 of the recommendations in that report, I think, are things that need to be seriously considered, and that would be moving us towards a very comprehensive accountability ecosystem. And they're all going to work together to do that. I want to lift up 3 of them in particular that I think are worthy of consideration, especially for lawmakers and legislators right now. The first of which is regarding disclosure and transparency requirements. There's quite a bit of literature already and many ideas for how better transparency and disclosure in terms of things like making data sets more transparent, requiring the publication of things like model cards, and doing simple disclosures like making deployers responsible for making sure that consumers that they are interacting with know that they are interacting with an AI system, or know when an AI system has impacted a decision or other outcome that a consumer has when they're interacting with that deployer. If you're using this technology commercially, you should have a responsibility to make sure that you're being transparent about what is going on there, especially as we continue to develop best practices and guidelines for how to do deployment and for how to ensure that these systems are safe and accountable. The second one that I want to lift up is regarding independent auditing guidelines. And there's a couple of things in the report actually about this. But independent auditing is a tool that we know is going to be really important for ensuring that AI systems are safe and accountable. I particularly want to lift up the work of Dr. Joy Buolamwini and the Algorithmic Justice League for what they have written about the importance of AI auditing and evaluations, and specifically on the importance to make sure that there is real independence for those auditors and that we need real guidelines. They cannot just be a different thing, that every person has different ways that they are approaching audits. Otherwise, they're going to be ineffective. And if we have ineffective audits and evaluations, they are, at best, a rubber stamp on a potentially dangerous system. And at worst, they become kind of an onerous hurdle that big tech companies will jump through and they'll get the rubber stamp, but they can use it to throw up a barrier against smaller competitors in that space. And so when we're particularly worried about consolidation in this area, we want to make sure that if we're doing audits and evaluations, that they are really effective. And that means developing real guidelines to make sure that we have effective audits and then putting that in the hands of real independent evaluators who can make sure that these are real tools for making sure that people are safe. The third one that I want to jump to is what they call enabling cross-sectoral, strengthening cross-sectoral capacity for the government. And this goes to we need those very sector-specific regulators who are already on the beat doing their job. They need to have their resources, but we also need that kind of broad horizontal regulatory authority. We need real expert guidance and flexibility that can adapt with the technology, that can learn about it in depth, that can help other federal agencies, and that can have itself broad regulatory oversight over this area. Public Knowledge has for a long time been calling for the creation of a digital regulator to oversee the kinds of digital platforms that hugely impact our digital lives already. It's long overdue to have that kind of oversight in the digital platform space. And that should include AI and algorithms and automated decision-making systems that are increasingly deployed through those platforms to affect Americans. And we know that that's not something that can that prevents innovation and competition. In fact, today we have a great example of it in the news, which is that the Federal Communications Commission just voted a little while ago to restore net neutrality rules through Title II of the Communications Act. What that means is that they are taking the broad regulatory authority that they need back when they mistakenly divested themselves of it under the Trump administration, and taking that regulatory authority back is going to enable them to protect a free and open internet. It's going to protect competition. It's going to drive innovation. It's going to protect consumers. And all of that can only happen if you have that kind of broad regulatory authority and you have a regulator who can really understand the nuances of the market and the changing importance of a technology like the internet to make sure that it is being overseen correctly. So that's the same kind of thing that we need in the space of digital platforms and artificial intelligence if we're going to ensure that we have a real environment of safety and accountability and trustworthiness in AI systems.
Thank you, Nick. Super, super helpful. And I encourage everybody to read. I joke that report's linked in. That report really does do a great job of consolidating a tremendous amount of feedback, and really strong props to the NDIA team there. I want to go to our final issue that we had kind of talked about on elections. Lisa, you talked about the potential impact of AI in elections and disinformation, including the potential impact of deepfakes and other synthetic media. You talked about some of the great work Public Citizens doing in the States. We've also heard a lot of kind of questions about potential constitutional issues with regulating AI and its output. And can you talk a little bit about how you think lawmakers should think about these kind of complicated legal issues as they're particularly looking at it in the kind of elections context?
Yeah, and thanks for this question, Adam. So as you likely know, the Supreme Court has recognized the right to lie as First Amendment protected, but fraud is not First Amendment protected. And we think that the use of generative AI to show someone saying or doing something that they didn't do clearly falls into the category of fraudulent behavior intended for deception. So disclosure that AI was used to make the communication is the remedy, because dispelling the fraud, does not require validating whether the statements made in the deepfake communication created by AI are true or false. The fraud is the fact that the person didn't do or say what they're being portrayed to have done or said. So again, this distinguishes deceptive deepfakes from lies. For deepfakes, the cure does not require any alteration of the speech, but merely an adequate disclosure of how the communication was made. It was made via AI. In the real world, if a candidate misrepresents an opponent's position, the opponent can clarify the record. Voters can work out the truth for themselves. But with a deep fake, the targeted candidate is not really able to engage in effective counter speech. The best they can do is offer a seemingly self-interested denial that the listener will have to judge against the strength of her trust in her own perceptions. So in this circumstance, voters really don't have the tools currently to find the truth out for themselves. So legislation creating disclosure requirements or a prohibition on fraudulent, deceptive deepfakes would be consistent with the First Amendment. The government's power to protect people against fraud is clearly recognized in this country and firmly established. And the First Amendment doesn't shield fraud in any medium. So, as Congress moves forward with their remedies, they should just keep that point in mind and legislation flows from it.
Thank you, Lisa. Super helpful. And I know it's of great interest to lawmakers. So we've covered kind of questions now on the 4 topics, excuse me, that we highlighted about this event. And one thing, though, we haven't mentioned is privacy. And that's something I know a lot of our groups have worked on over the years. I think most of us would agree it's probably a foundational piece for potential AI regulation, or it might be difficult to regulate AI without privacy legislation. And so I did want to hold a space here for a moment to just mention that and maybe ask Frank to talk a little bit, expound a slight bit on why, privacy might be so important when it comes to AI regulation, why that shouldn't be off the table either.
Yeah, so simply put, privacy rights in this day and age are civil rights. The way our data is collected and used now in AI systems is a development that we need to get a handle on. And the way we get a handle on it is through strong data protections. In the past, we talked about big data and the importance of, giving people some opportunity to control the data, to have the ability to opt out, to know how the data is being used. I think that now in this new technological AI era, we also have to consider the impact of data use in AI systems. And that's why, I know many groups are still kind of going through the recently published draft or discussion draft of the American Privacy Protection Act, which follows on the heels of what the last Congress did around the ADPPA, another privacy bill. But that both of those bills, bipartisan in the case of the APRA or APRA bill, is also bipartisan and bicameral. Which we think is significant. And it recognizes not just that there needs to be strong privacy protections around data minimization and other protections, but there also needs to be consideration of civil rights protections. And so we think that is significant because they both go hand in glove. AI is obviously driven by data, and the more we can put people in control and put some parameters around the data, the more helpful it will be to preventing some of the concerns that we have around civil rights protections. And again, just to be clear, people are still haven't, many groups haven't, made a decision. Well, I mean, everybody's kind of going through the bill.
Totally. But I think it speaks to the fact that privacy seems like a fundamental aspect to make either of AI regulation, or as Congress is looking to make it easier to figure out how to regulate AI, having passed a privacy law, for instance, might make that easier to then kind of bucket out. So I think certainly something we all think is really important. I want to take 2 audience questions, or 1 or 2 or 3 audience questions at the time we have, and I'll throw this open to all participants, and then we'll close to make sure folks can get out of here on time. We have a question here from Twitter. The EU is known to provide tech privacy protections superior to those of existing and proposed stateside legislation. What expert groups monitor or collaborate with extranational groups, i.e. around AI development or regulation? And if not, why not? I think that the question is really asking, given the EU has taken a lead on both privacy with the GDPR and now with the EU AI Act, how is it that US groups like ourselves, but also lawmakers, should be learning from that, collaborating, and how do we think about that impact as civil society? And so I'll toss this to the groups. I'll say certainly that we, from CAP's point of view, we pay attention to the many venues that we are opening binationally. So obviously the AI Safety Summit that occurred in the UK last year, the EU Tech and Trade Council, and other aspects. But I think one of the benefits of the EU moving first on GDPR and then the EU AI Act is it gives us the DSA and DMA is it gives us here in the United States a chance to learn from it as well and see what its impact are. But I will throw it up to others on the panel to say how they might think about what has happened in the EU and how it should inform our work or lawmakers' work here in the US.
One thing that I would point out in this regard, because you mentioned it earlier, Adam, is that we have the nascent US AI Safety Institute established through NIST. It's not fully formally established yet, although it was established through the executive order. And I know that there are groups even on this call that are participants in the AI Safety Institute. Bodies like that are critically important, not just for developing guidelines and oversight for here in the United States, but the US AI Safety Institute already has a memorandum of understanding with the UK's AI Safety Institute, which got a little bit of a head start on us, as you said, with the UK's safety summits over there. And so we need bodies like the AI Safety Institute in the United States who can work with their counterparts in the UK and Europe and other places around the world in order to ensure that we are learning from the best practices that are popping up elsewhere, in order to ensure that we are harmonizing requirements around the world in order to make sure that we are protected in a global perspective, because the internet and technology is global now. And so that's really important. And as you mentioned, Adam, critical to that is making sure that places like NIST are fully funded. And that is something that legislators need to act on. Public Knowledge was one of the co-leads on that letter that you mentioned, to make sure that NIST has that full budget to be able to fully establish things like the AI Safety Institute, and in order to make sure that we're able to develop those guidelines in partnership with international partners like that.
Great. One more question, and then we'll close it up. We got a question by email. During the early stages of computers and the internet, the most common fault was described by the phrase garbage in, garbage out. Can AI be developed with excellence and profundity and not marketed until ignorance, stupidity, and purposeful misinformation has been eliminated from the data? I think this question is getting to the kind of core components of AI requires a lot of data to train, and a lot of the data out there is maybe not super great. And so would love to hear from our various panelists about how they think about that kind of question about training and how we can make sure that it's reliable.
Well, I'll jump in and just say it's complicated, and there should be really focused effort on ensuring and having a lot of public requirements for data integrity. We also need to make sure that we are respecting copyright and intellectual property of the people who are producing and really make their livelihoods by producing media and data. And I think that you can look closely at the work that the Writers Guild and some of our entertainment unions, the Newspaper Guild, have been doing around ensuring that training data also fairly compensates the people who produce that data.
Well, thank you, everyone. I'd like to go to closing thoughts now, and feel free to not just stick to the topic you spoke to, but any of them. But the question I have for everyone here is, what are the consequences if lawmakers ignore these key 4 issues when they start to address AI? I think Ben kind of hinted at this in his opening remarks, that to do nothing or to ignore these issues is a decision in and of itself. And so I think it'd be great if you each shared some of the consequences you think might happen, or concerns you have if we don't have lawmakers take action on these key issues.
Well, I'll jump in. I think what we end up with at the end of the day is technology that no one trusts, because you don't know whether or not you're going to be treated fairly. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter your race, religion, anything. You walk into an institution or you go to seek healthcare, and the AI system is broken, doesn't work. How do you know that you're getting a fair shake? And I think Congress would be remiss, for all the talk about innovation and competition as being important. I think not acting to provide these protections, like we've done and Congress has done in the past at this stage when other industries have evolved to this level, it would seriously undermine. First of all, would continue harm to people, undermine the technology itself and the innovation and competition, and actually also hurt the potential beneficial uses of the technology, which we'd be remiss if we didn't recognize that there are beneficial uses.
I'll jump in just to follow on, and just first say I completely agree with everything Frank just said, and we are actually at an opportunity moment to get this right. So we should underscore that point that you just made. Just to speak specifically about the democracy issues I was talking about, I mean, I think the consequences of not grappling with the impact of AI in elections, I mean, it's barreling at us at rapid speed. We have really severe potential near-term consequences for 2024, as well as the long-term impacts that we're all talking about. Near term, again, like more and more real disinformation and AI generated political deep fakes, which could impact contests. But long term, exactly as Frank was saying, we will eventually see the undermining of social trust as it becomes harder to discern truth from reality.
Nick, Amanda?
I'll follow on and say, I agree with Frank's point. Will people trust the technology? Will people see that it's worth investing in the development of the technology the way our government seems to want to do? Agree also with Lisa's point. There's a real fundamental question about trust in public discourse. And I think that for workers and for working people, left unregulated, left unchecked, it could create a real sort of maelstrom for people who, particularly people who are already in the workforce, who may be experience degradation of their job or even job loss, and how to get back into the workforce, how you can actually make it work. We've seen what NAFTA did, and the sort of deindustrialization of the United States, and that's a potential consequence here too, if we don't really look at the economic consequences and the real need for worker power around this conversation.
Yeah, I will just add +1 to everything that everyone else has said. And the last thing I will add is just, we run the risk of entrenchment. If we don't act now and we don't act early, it's going to come to the point where people are going to say, well, this is already how things are, and we can't change it now. We didn't act soon enough. So let's act now before it becomes the status quo that nobody wants to change, and make sure we get it right from the beginning.
I think to echo everyone that this is a moment of cautious optimism. There is a moment where we can make a difference, where we can make sure that this develops in a way that is innovative, provides opportunities to working people, protects civil rights, but that has to be an active choice. And to not make it an active choice kind of means that we are saying that it's okay to innovate in violating workers' rights, or innovate in violating civil rights, or innovate in violating, the kind of integrity of our elections, or that. So I think it is really essential that lawmakers take this seriously and get it right. We're heartened by the work that the Senate and House seem to be doing, and look forward to seeing what they put out. And we want to thank everybody for joining us on a Thursday afternoon for a conversation that we're happy and will continue with these groups. I want to thank Lisa and Public Citizen, Amanda and the AFL-CIO, Frank and the Leadership Conference, and Nick from Public Knowledge for joining us today. And thank you everyone in the audience for joining. And we're getting you out of here about on time. So thank you everyone. Really appreciate it.